Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Delaney, Executive Director of RFK Human Rights, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the summer edition of our RFK Book Club. We've got a great one for you today. We host the book club several times a year, but in the summer, we always feature the winner of our Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. This spring, that prize went to Jonathan Blitzer for Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, the United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. Congratulations, Jonathan. And thank you to Nisa Patel and Belina Pristina, who organized these terrific gatherings. As some of you know, our book award was founded by historian Arthur Schlesinger in 1978 with the proceeds from his biography, Robert F. Kennedy and His Times. It remains the best book, the best account of his life and his work. So if you can get your hands on a copy, I highly recommend it. It looks like this, and as you can see, mine is very tattered and loved and worn. And if you'd like more information about our Book and Journalism Awards or about any of our work, or if you'd like to support more content like this, please go to rfkhumanrights.org. Today, we'll have a moderated discussion followed by a short Q&A period. We do not have to look far today for a moderator. I'm pleased to introduce our Vice President of U.S. Advocacy and Litigation, Anthony Enriquez. Anthony is an attorney who focuses on stopping abuses in our criminal legal and immigration systems. He leads our team who seek accountability for state-sponsored racial discrimination, torture, arbitrary detention, and extrajudicial killings. With over 10 years of expertise in child refugee protection, in immigrant rights, and anti-detention advocacy, you can imagine how busy Anthony is these days. Anthony, over to you.
Who has reported for over a decade on immigration, politics, and foreign affairs, intertwining historic influence in real-world implementation and impact. His writing and reporting have also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Atavist, Oxford American, and The Nation. And we are thrilled to be discussing his first book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. This book was named one of the 10 best books of 2024 by the New York Times and received the 2025 Hillman Prize for Book Journalism, as well as this year's Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, I see you're joining us from the woods. I'm joining you from the city. So
yeah, perfect. We
Bridging.
coordinated that perfectly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I congratulate you first and foremost on an almost encyclopedic recounting of immigration policy, of Central American political history, of American political history. This book, in so many ways, is multiple books in one. And I'd like to start by asking, what is it that you, the author, hoped that readers would learn from this book? And as you're answering that question, I think I'd also like to know, what did you know or think you knew when you started writing it? And what was it that you actually learned in the process of writing it?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. To speak sort of generally first about what kind of my overall aims were for this book. I guess they were kind of a few, and I thought about them in different categories. The first and to my mind most important part was to introduce readers to people. I actually think that the way most people in this country tend to absorb news about immigration policy, news about Latin America, tends to be through the kind of abstracted lens of American politics. And so I think it almost is like staring down the wrong end of a telescope, and the actual people who are affected by all of these policy questions, political debates, and so on are kind of, tunneled away from people as opposed to being actually front and center. And for me, just on a personal level, that's always been kind of the most important part. And that's been the most profound element of my journalistic education, has been actually learning from individual people. To me, the journalism was always kind of a pretext, quite honestly, to try to get to close to people whose experiences were wholly different from mine. And so, as you can imagine, and I know this is true for you, given your work, you meet so many incredible people whose lives kind of embody so many different iterations of, U.S. history, Latin American history, all of these policy questions, and people kind of live out all of these facts in very idiosyncratic and personal ways. And so I really wanted to begin with to communicate just the full force of that human experience to people. Because again, I really think that if sort of general readers approached some of these issues a little bit more from the mindset of trying to understand kind of what the human stakes are rather than what the political stakes are, I do think it would change the way we all collectively have some of the political conversations and understand some of the political news. So that was kind of like a general philosophical thing. And then kind of drilling down more specifically, and it's kind of therapeutic for me to talk to you of all people about this because I know you know this so well. I really think in general terms, people tend to think about the crisis involving our asylum system, which now almost is a sort of secondary question of what immigration policy debates look and sound like. But I think people always treated the kind of the asylum question as a question of what happened at the U.S. southern border. And to my mind, that's like picking up a book and starting to read it like in the last chapter, or like walking into a movie that's 2 hours long and like sitting down with your popcorn at an hour and 50 minutes. It doesn't make sense. There's so much history. There's so much backstory you have to understand. And so during a lot of the most intense years of my reporting during the first Trump administration, there was a large number of people from Central America seeking asylum at the southern border. And I think there was very little understanding of the degree to which that was just the latest chapter in an ongoing story involving the United States and Central America. And so again, and this goes back to sort of my earlier point, people tend to understand stuff in terms dictated and pre-digested by Washington. So in 2014, you have Obama's border crisis, and I say this explicitly at a certain point in the book. You have Obama's border crisis in 2014. You have Trump's so-called border crisis in 2019. You have Biden's border crisis in 2021. And in fact, all of those are just blips in a much bigger story that begins. I mean, it begins much farther back than the 1980s, but to my mind, kind of one of the better ways of understanding holistically the different cycles of migration at play is to really start in the 1980s and see how whole lives of people, of families, of countries actually kind of cycle through in different ways and explain the present moment. So that was very much the goal. I learned, I mean, I talk now a lot about this stuff, and I've actually never been asked. I love the question. I've never really been asked directly, like, all right, so like, what did you think you knew coming in, and like, what did you sort of get schooled on? Um, I have to say there were kind of different phases of it because I spent so much time, I spent so many years reporting this thing, and in some cases, I was reporting with people who were central to the book. Um, Before I knew that there was a book in this. So my education really began in some cases in a kind of more happenstance way with them. So for example, there's a main figure in this book named Eddie Anzora, who now lives in El Salvador. He lived in the United States from age 3 to age 30 in Los Angeles. Eventually got deported in 2007, 2008 as a result of a 1990s era law that kind of caught him up in one of its more unfair and draconian kind of policies. But I remember, and I will never in my life forget when I first met him, we were sitting down for a beer in San Salvador in 2016. And I was there actually reporting a different story about the legacy of the Salvadoran Civil War. And I had heard about Eddie through kind of a friend of a friend, because apparently he had started this language school and he was training people who had recently been deported from the United States to speak a kind of customer service inflected English, to work in these call centers, which were booming during the years of increasing mass deportation from the United States, because you had a workforce of people who spoke idiomatic American English, who were arriving back in a country where their job prospects were slim, where they hadn't been in the country for many, many years. They were desperate for work. And anyway, Eddie and I sit down to have a conversation. And for the first 2 hours of our conversation, all we talk about is early 1980s era Los Angeles. And it blew my mind. It blew my mind. I mean, this is maybe obvious to people, and this betrays my own ignorance, but here we were in San Salvador, 30 years later, and this guy's knowledge and fluency in the West Coast put mine to shame. I mean, I knew nothing. I actually knew nothing. And so, here I was in San Salvador learning things about Los Angeles that I hadn't known. And that experience actually on a profound level, like shaped how I went about reporting this book and doing my work in general, which is, you tend to learn more about the United States sometimes when you're out of the country or when you're viewing it from this kind of vantage that isn't the obvious one. So that was one global thing. And I'll just say, not to give you too long-winded of an answer, but I do think that two other things immediately came to mind in response to your question about kind of things that I learned and things that I thought I knew going in that I turned out not to know. One was the degree to which there was a stable consensus around the value of asylum and refugee policy in the US. I had kind of always assumed, I mean, much of my education really about that history started in earnest during the first Trump administration the US government was essentially trying to undo much of the asylum and system and refugee program as we knew them. And so, given the force of the pushback at the time, something I wish we would have again, but which we're really past, there was kind of this moment of general resistance, and you had people, not just Democrats, not just kind of more progressive-minded people, but institutionalists, really on kind of on both sides of the aisle, who were appalled by the degree to which the administration then was kind of tearing down these systems that existed. And so I kind of had this notion in my head. I mean, I and many other reporters at the time were trying to describe all of the ways in which the government was laying waste to the asylum system. And to do that, you kind of have to, at the same time, explain to readers how that system is meant to work. And I had always kind of assumed to a certain degree that it had worked in some form or another. And what this history kind of showed me was that no, it's really never, I mean, since 1980, it's been a promise that the government has made in law that it's never actually delivered on for political reasons. And the politics change every decade. But the thing that's thrown out the window every time is the humanitarianism of the asylum system. So that was an education for me to see that it had been in peril, maybe not as grave peril as it has been in recent years, but has been some form of peril going back to its earliest moments. And the last thing I will say is the main kind of the beating heart of the book, Juan Ramagosa, this Salvadoran doctor and human rights advocate and public health leader, who's probably one of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. When I first started working on this book, I actually had never spoken to him, which is kind of wild to think about now because his story had not only restructured my own understanding of this broader history, but quite literally is the force and structure of this book. And I knew certain details about him, and we had friends in common, but I didn't know all that much specifically about activism from people like Juan in Central America in the 80s. I was with liberation theology, which I kind of thought I knew about in general terms, but didn't understand in concrete terms, what that would mean for a doctor from Usulután, El Salvador, on a day-to-day level, kind of what his activism would consist of in El Salvador, and why that would, of course, put him on this collision course with a repressive government. And by extension, also, kind of what activists in the US were doing in the 1980s. I knew very little about that stuff. And that was a real thrill to learn about. So anyway, sorry, an extremely long-winded answer to your first question.
Well, it was an extremely thoughtful answer, and I will say there's some provocation in there too. So I'm interested in digging into some of the questions that came from your answers. But one thing that struck me was your connection with the human element and the use of individual and human stories to really map out the larger story behind this. And that's something that I think both of our practices have in common, is really honoring the dignity of individual people, recognizing that every single person has a human right, a a worth, a value that can't be taken away. And your reporting really drives that story home. I want to, for our listeners, to really ground us in this conversation and some of the basic, let's say, facts of the story. And so I think it'd be useful if you could briefly sum up for us the role that the United States has played in Central American political history and how that has interacted with the immigration system that we live with today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the full history of American involvement in Central America goes back the whole way, centuries. But for my purposes, I'm picking up the story in the latter half, let's say, of the 20th century, when the kind of dominant U.S. ideology governing the U.S. relationship to countries in Latin America, all across Latin America, and it's in this case specifically in Central America, was the Cold War and fear in Washington that the spread of leftist movements in Central and South America would kind of lap up against the US southern border and kind of sweep the US. And so what that meant in practice was all kinds of things. It meant kind of first and foremost that the US government allied itself with repressive right-wing, predominantly military regimes in places like El Salvador, most notably El Salvador, eventually with some complicated historical twists and turns in Nicaragua, in Guatemala for sure, in Honduras, which was actually called all through the 1980s the USS Honduras because of the degree to which US military involvement was just an explicit fact of daily life there. And what the US government was essentially doing, and it was, to my mind, the most dramatic in the case of El Salvador during the 1980s was it was trying to help the right-wing military regime prosecute a civil war against a group of leftist insurgents. And so the US government gave military aid and advising, weapons, money, sent officers and military strategists to El Salvador and to the region to help Salvadoran military men kind of plot out their campaign. And it also meant giving these countries all sorts of diplomatic cover at a time when they were committing massive human rights atrocities. And so one of the biggest things that happened all across the region, and was particularly, for the sake of our story in El Salvador, was that anyone really who ran afoul of the military regime in El Salvador was basically treated like a kind of terrorist or criminal. And there were mass disappearances, there were murders, there was torture on a scale that's unthinkable. And this could mean anything from, sure, guerrillas or left-wing insurgents who were opposed to the military regime and all of the kind of economic inequality and corruption and repression that it had kind of carried out over all of these years. But it also meant that, like, if you were, working in a factory and were organizing a union in that factory, that you would be prosecuted basically as a criminal insurgent. And someone like Juan, this doctor at the center of my book, he was a medical student in the 1970s, and he was kind of inculcated at a young age with this idea, this ethos of wanting to provide free medical care to the poor, especially the rural poor in the country, which lived under an extreme amount of poverty and discrimination. And that put him in the crosshairs of the military repression because that meant that he was, traveling out into the countryside in parts of the country where, insurgents were fighting the government for control over territory. And there was an assumption that anyone who had this kind of leftist bent, who had a kind of a progressive agenda, was in some way aligned with these insurgents and therefore was a dangerous threat and had to be eliminated. And so, one of the things that was happening during all of this time was there were increasing reports of what these governments were doing all across the region, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. And the US government tried to really sweep it under the rug because it wanted to continue to provide military aid and diplomatic support to these governments. One of the consequences of that in terms of migration was all through the 1980s, you basically had the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people who were being politically persecuted. I mean, there was effectively a genocide in parts of Guatemala against the indigenous population. In El Salvador, it was almost a textbook case of people seeking asylum in the United States as a result of fleeing persecution by the government at home. And so you have all of this stuff happening in the 1980s at the same time that you have the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, which essentially, for the first time in US history, was meant to codify asylum and refugee practice in an American statute, to basically give people the legal right to seek protection if they're being persecuted. And so you have this kind of immediate paradox in US policy. On the one hand, you have the United States government supporting and actually supplying arms and all the rest for this massive level of repression against the local populations. And at the same time, when those people arrived at the US southern border seeking asylum under the language of this new statute, the US government denied asylum specifically to people from these countries in question, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, because if the US government were to grant them asylum, it would basically mean tacitly acknowledging that they were fleeing repressive governments who happened to be allies of the United States. And so all through the 1980s, you had hundreds of thousands of people from El Salvador and from Guatemala fleeing to the United States, not easily being able to regularize their status in any fashion. For a while, many of them tried to apply for asylum at the southern border, as the law dictated, at a time when 23% of people seeking asylum at the southern border were granted asylum. Those from El Salvador and Guatemala had their asylum applications rejected at rates of 98 and 99%. And so
Wow.
it became pointless almost to try to apply for asylum. And so people basically just tried to live their lives in the United States. And so the great irony to me was, here in Washington, you had this obsession with containing the spread of leftism in the region, but actually, what that meant practically for the United States government was to prop up regimes that drove the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people from the region, who actually ended up creating much closer and more intimate ties between the United States and El Salvador, between the United States and Guatemala, that we now live with culturally, historically, politically, in every sense from the 80s onward.
And so I think to sum it up pretty neatly, the United States had a strong hand in creating a refugee crisis that they then inflicted upon themselves in some ways. It seems to be a big part of the history of the region. I'd also like for listeners to really understand the import of the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, as Jonathan was telling us. The origins of that are really international human rights treaties that were signed in the 1950s and 60s, related to international agreements to establish some type of system of refuge for people fleeing persecution. Persecution has a very narrow legal definition, which means a threat to the life or freedom or the risk of serious harm on the basis of your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or what's called your particular social group, which could encompass a number of personal identity characteristics someone might have, such as their sexuality, their gender, or other groups that aren't defined with particularity in law. The origins of that legal regime really came from the practice of turning away people who were fleeing the Holocaust in World War II, of the shameful histories of countries who said, we cannot extend help here, we cannot open our lands to anyone who's fleeing certain death. The world as a whole decided that's not a situation that can ever be repeated. And so we here compact to make sure it never will be. Notwithstanding that these treaties were signed in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't until 1980, as Jonathan commented, that we really had that enshrined in domestic law. And yet from the start, Jonathan, you've said this a couple of times, the system was already dysfunctional. The system was lacking the type of support domestically or capacity to really handle the volume of claims, to really make good on the promises that were made in law. Some people, however, were a part of really invigorating this system. And your book does, I think, an excellent job of telling the particular history and involvement of religious communities. and particularly white Protestant religious communities that played a crucial role in invigorating the right to seek asylum in the mid-1980s, really right at the genesis of the system. Today, we don't typically hear of that same leadership role. At the time, these were groups that were inviting people to take sanctuary in churches. There were some criminal prosecutions even of people who had facilitated people's access to the asylum system. There were several national lawsuits that were filed that were accusing the government of prejudging some of these asylum applications that ended up being victorious, where the government then had to go back and offer second opportunities for people to apply for or receive asylum. And yet today we don't typically hear of this same leadership role for religious groups in the same way. It certainly happens. There are some stories of some churches offering sanctuary to people during the first Trump administration. We heard about that. This year, RFK Human Rights gave a Human Rights Award to Jeanette Bisquerra, a woman who herself took sanctuary in a church for several years during the Trump's first administration. But what I'm interested in is your thoughts on what do you think accounts for the changing role of religious leaders in immigration policy, or what accounts for the fact that we used to have a very rigorous religious presence in this idea of extending asylum. What kinds of dynamics are at play that we don't see that as much and as often here in our contemporary immigration debates?
It's such a good question, and you, I mean, to your credit, very graciously had kind of forewarned me that you were going to ask me this question. And so I thought about it a bit, and I actually kind of thought, not for this to be a cop out, but I also wanted to hear your thoughts because I myself am mystified about some of it. Um, as you say, like these activists in the '80s, the sanctuary movement, it was a that was a real revelation to me in my reporting, like just the degree to which people, everyday people, could kind of find some sort of moral and religious validation for the horror that they felt on just a visceral daily level about, what was happening to people in Central America and the fact that the US government wasn't bothering to extend them any protections at the US southern border. And they would all bristle at being described as engaging in civil disobedience because what all of them said to a person, and I loved this, was they would say, look, we're not breaking the law. In fact, we're actually trying to make good on the law. The Reagan administration is ignoring the 1980 Refugee Act. We're the ones who are trying to operationalize it. And what that meant was at great personal risk to themselves. They were helping people cross the border. And the model of advocacy around it was for these primarily white, Protestant activists to kind of be the public face of the activism, but for a lot of the Central American refugees to offer their stories. Oftentimes, it was much riskier for them to come out and just describe what they had been through, who they were. So oftentimes they would use pseudonyms or in some cases famously cover their face with a mask while they testified. But the idea in any case was to kind of yoke the kind of moral advocacy delivered in terms that kind of white America could understand with the actual firsthand accounts of people whose lives were caught up in all of this. And it had I think, a major impact publicly. The church since then, I mean, I don't, aside from kind of the obvious contenders, like increasing political polarization and the role of kind of culture war issues to drive a wedge into religious communities across the country, it's hard for me to understand why that kind of core advocacy has just sort of evaporated over the years. I mean, I do think that as the political debate over immigration has steadily shifted rightward over the years, I do think that even this kind of baseline advocacy, which in the 1980s, sure, it was controversial insofar as it prompted, federal indictments and arrests and so on, but it wasn't seen as being such a kind of moral flashpoint. I think there was a sort of general feeling that, okay, well, this sort of makes basic human sense. And maybe these guys are a little too kind of dovish for our taste, and maybe these guys are like taking it a little too far by crossing people over the border. But that seems like essentially, I don't want to say an uncontroversial commitment, but one that doesn't kind of immediately divide along ideological lines per se. Whereas now, I don't know. I don't know if like the accumulated effect of failed comprehensive immigration reform in which religious communities were active, I think, in earlier pushes for reform, only to see those reform efforts founder in Congress. I don't know if that kind of, in some ways, seemed to delegitimize their advocacy or seemed to compromise them politically. But I just think as the political discourse has shifted to the right, I think there's like a degree of risk aversion from religious leaders that is heartbreaking to see in real time, because I actually think this is kind of on the merits of individual policies. It's this stuff is complicated. It's very hard to kind of like make the case to everyday Americans about needing to have a more humane immigration system. There needs to be a kind of moral presence in the debate. Um, so these are like only half-formed thoughts, because I myself, and I have to say, like, and one of the reasons why I actually want to hear you, like, I very much am interested in hearing your thoughts, because like I want to eventually be able to quote you on this in stories I'm writing, because I have to say, like, just as an example, as you say, churches that offered sanctuary during the first Trump administration versus now. Um, I was thinking about how to even write stories about this, about kind of what this looks like in real time, because like many other journalists during the first Trump term, I wrote about people who entered sanctuary, because at the time, immigration enforcement had a kind of general policy where, churches, places of, religious worship were more or less off limits from immigration enforcement. And so the person you mentioned, Jeanette Vizquerra, who's currently in immigration custody now under the current administration, um, really took an enormous risk. And I think there was like a real sense of commitment and solidarity among faith groups. And now a lot of those same churches aren't doing it. Now, some of that is because there have been like criminal penalties in places like Texas, and now increasingly all across the country. The administration is trying to penalize people who are involved in legal advocacy and kind of direct service advocacy. That doesn't explain the historical shift that you're asking about. It certainly explains why churches and other groups right now are scared to stick their necks out. But anyway, I mean, I'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, well, just as you, I was interested in hearing your thoughts, because it's obviously been thinking deeply on this.
Yeah.
I think I wonder if the general declining religiosity of America as a nation is part of this story, because I don't think there's a simple solution, a very clear-cut answer here. But alongside with that general declining religiosity, there's been an entrenching, I think, polarization of what it means to be religious as
Yeah.
well, too. And those who um, do attend a church regularly, are affiliated with more organized religions, um, are those congregations have been increasingly tied to more conservative political movements. So in the 1990s, oftentimes, in the early 2000s, it was opposition, for instance, to same-sex marriage. And it's those who maybe would have identified with more progressive-minded or quote-unquote liberal causes have found themselves less at home in
Yeah.
churches of organized religion.
Yeah.
And that means that they don't have that institution and that the protection of that institution and the organizing capacity of that institution as well
Yeah.
to really play a role in these debates. I think as well, it's interesting because I live in New York City. I think we both live in New York City.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we're pretty familiar with seeing different congregations that are only in their language or are principally for people from a region of the country. And it's difficult to get people who are already at risk of enforcement, as you pointed out, to say to them, well, you also have the burden of standing up for everyone's
Right.
right too.
Right.
You also have the burden of making yourself a target. But as we see less and less connection, more segregation in some senses along racial lines, which is a long part of the American experiment in history.
Yeah.
We see that there is less of an opportunity for groups not at risk, or less of a willingness really
Yeah.
to stand up, maybe because they just don't understand, because they don't have that contact that
Yeah.
comes from those first person interactions with people.
Yeah.
So um, a complex issue, certainly, that
Yeah.
really has a lot of different causes. But let's shift a little bit in to here at RFK Human Rights. Our program focuses specifically on reducing the power and size of mass incarceration in both the immigration and the criminal systems. And people often say, well, mass incarceration in the immigration system, I don't understand. But in fact, there are today 60,000 people held in immigration detention in facilities scattered across the country. 90% of people in those of that number are held in private prisons. And so there's a massive profit incentive to this detention system. And something that I was struck by when I read your book was we really didn't hear about the emergence of detention and its essential part of the immigration system until the Marielitos in the 1980s. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe explain to our listeners who were the Marielitos and why is it that you think with their appearance, detention suddenly became imperative to the functioning of the US immigration system?
Yeah, this is just to go back to just keep returning to your original question of sort of things that I learned kind of at the outset reporting this book. The Mariel boat lift of 1980, I didn't quite grasp before how foundational it was in cultural terms, historical terms, and then, of course, very specifically in terms of really enshrining this idea politically of jailing immigrants in the United States. So basically, I believe it was a month after the 1980 Refugee Act was signed. I mean, a matter of weeks after the Refugee Act was signed in 1980. Rafts started to arrive in South Florida from Cuba because there was a group of Cubans trying to essentially flee the country, and they were camped out in an embassy in Cuba. And this was going into an election year in the United States. This is obviously a pitched political battle between the United States and Cuba. The embargo was in effect. All of the kind of Cold War battle lines were drawn around this issue. And Fidel Castro, who in a certain sense, the leader of Cuba at the time, in a certain sense, could be kind of politically, embarrassed by the idea of all of these people fleeing his country. There was this idea that would be a kind of a testament to the various failures of the state in Cuba. He decided to kind of double down on this moment of exodus and kind of put pressure on Carter, who was up for re-election. And so basically what he started to do was he tried to send more and more people from Cuba to the United States. This became known as the Mariel Boat Lift. And there were large numbers of people who took advantage of this moment to just flee the country, but mixed among them by the design of Fidel Castro were people who had been, jailed in different capacities in Cuba, either in psychiatric institutions or in a criminal context in Cuba. And so you basically had, to kind of speed this up a little, you basically had 125,000 Cubans arrive in a matter of, weeks in South Florida in 1980. It's incredible because the authors of the 1980 Refugee Act were watching this just completely baffled because here they were, they had finally drawn up this plan to deal with, refugees, asylum seekers, and, they hadn't yet reckoned with the idea that there would be a kind of particular point of crisis at the US border or at a port of entry in South Florida where so many people would suddenly arrive and the government wasn't equipped to handle all of them, to process all of them, to figure out who they were exactly. And so basically what happened in the months following was the US government scrambled. It was completely overwhelmed and outmatched by kind of just the sheer logistical force of all of these people arriving at one time. Some of them did have criminal records. Some of them did commit crimes once they arrived in the United States. The US government tried to hold almost all of them in military barracks all across the country. This became a political fight all across the country where, the US government would try to send some of these Marielitos. They were known, the Cubans who arrived in the Mariel boat lift were known as Marielitos. They were sent to places like, Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. And, there was a kind of political fight in Arkansas over, we don't want them. We don't want them sent here to our communities. And actually, Bill Clinton lost the first race that Bill Clinton lost was as governor as a result of the political fallout over the fact that his state was accepting Marielitos in an actual military barracks in his state. But this happened, as you can imagine, in all kinds of other places. And it really kind of supercharged what immigration enforcement started to look like in the US. And it did it almost overnight, where you suddenly started to have coordination and cooperation between local police and federal immigration authorities. At the time, it wasn't the Department of Homeland Security or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It was the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. And there are books and journalists much more expert on the subject than I. But my sense, just from my research, and you probably know more about some of this than I do, but my sense was that at a time of rising urban crime, immigrants kind of became a very convenient scapegoat at the local level. And so you started to have local law enforcement blaming a lot of crime, in some cases without basis, on the arrival of this new immigrant population. And that became the kind of justification for, starting to enlist private companies to open up jail and prison space to hold people, the idea that there were, criminal charges you could try to bring against immigrants. And if you look at the press from that era, it's incredibly striking just to see how much more kind of aggressive and militant the rhetoric is from elected officials. Actually, in some ways, it's sort of the rhetoric that we have now, what kind of the world that we all live in now is the post-Marielle world. Um, and this, to be clear, this is not just a matter of kind of local law enforcement or large numbers of people staying in military barracks and having there be controversies over it. This started to appear in popular culture. I mean, I mentioned this just in passing in the book, but um, there's a famous Al Pacino uh, is this plays this Miami Cuban, this Marielito, criminal, gang member who's arrived in Florida, in Scarface, and the idea of someone who's just arrived, you actually see him in the early scenes of that movie in basically the equivalent of a compound where all of these immigrants have recently arrived and they're being processed, and he's already starting on his life of crime. I mean, this has really kind of entered the public consciousness at that time. And I think, to people who have really studied and analyzed kind of the rise of mass incarceration in the immigration context, this moment in the early 80s is really when it starts.
And I think the interesting thing for our purposes is the statistics bear out that, in fact, immigrants are less likely than native-born citizens to commit or be convicted of crimes, that communities that have a larger immigrant presence report less incidents of crime as well. And so if we think of the Al Pacino Scarface
Yeah,
vision of that being the prototypical Mariolito that was anything but.
100%.
And the immigration detention system itself isn't designed to punish people. That's not the function of it. And that's the criminal legal system still exists. And so if it happens to be that an immigrant commits or is convicted of a crime, they're still sent to jail as any citizen would be.
Right.
The immigration detention system is a double penalty added on to that, something sinister that exists only for people that weren't born in the United States or that haven't naturalized. And it's morphed now into a system of indefinite detention for tens of thousands of people, but a prison nonetheless. People who haven't been convicted of a crime, people who are awaiting an immigration court hearing with a judge to determine whether or not they might actually be entitled to an immigration status in the country. And so to see the origins of this be swept up and really be tied to this idea of the fearfulness of impending crime waves, and the dual birth of both the mass incarceration system that came from these in the 1980s in the criminal context and the immigration detention context, we start to see how really the two systems, both immigration and criminal, share that common locus of the mass incarceration as a simplistic solution to very complex issues at the end of the day.
And if I could just that I could not agree more with every facet of that. I just wanted to add two things, which is, just to those sort of keeping score at home, given our political state of affairs now. One of the most striking things for me during the first Trump term, just two points here. The first is one of the most striking things to me about, Trump as a campaigner going into the 2016 election, and obviously everything he's done since, was to sort of blow up individual instances of crimes committed by immigrants as though it were a kind of generalized trend. And to hold up the details, often, the grisliest details possible. And they went looking, members of the Trump campaign went looking for the most grisly examples of crimes committed by, immigrants or people who had recently arrived and so on, as a way of trying to scare the hell out of people in this country into thinking that the arrival of people meant increased crime, when in fact, every statistic, every metric that exists, every local law enforcement expert, police chiefs, sheriffs, you name it, all of them to a person have to, accept and often are very insistent on the fact that immigrants commit crimes at much lower rates than U.S. citizens, that communities that are largely comprised of immigrants tend to have much less crime. The idea was to skew the representation of these facts. And there was a very particular kind of campaign charade that Trump would engage in 2016, and it became kind of a hallmark, really, of his politics, to the extent that now it's just a sort of standard fact of Republican politics, which is to spotlight individual victims, and to just tell their story and to kind of make it seem like there's this sort of horde of criminals coming into the country. But I mean, I don't think that the Trump campaign in 2016 was particularly conscious of Mariel, but the seeds of that kind of bit of theater and rhetoric really go back to the early 80s. And the second thing I would say, just to your point, is, obviously the immigration detention context versus the criminal detention context. You're talking about the difference between civil infractions and immigration infractions versus, criminal infractions if someone were to commit a crime or be charged with a crime. Now the administration uses these terms interchangeably. And it's one of the things that drives me, I mean, take your pick of things that drive you crazy these days. But, just as a matter of the sheer force of kind of constant lies getting rained down on US media and Americans watching TV news, network news or whatever, what the administration will often say, for instance, when you had a group of Venezuelans largely falsely accused of being gang members and sent without due process in secret to a prison in El Salvador, you know, journalists got hold of the kind of, legal files of many of these men, of almost all of these men. And it turns out that the vast majority of them had no criminal record. But now the political response from the administration is to say, oh, no, what are you talking about? They all had criminal records. They all entered the country illegally, which is itself wrong, by the way. Many of the people actually not only had legal status, but actually were going through the legal process of trying to normalize their status. But it's the idea that oh, if you cross the border, you've committed a crime. And they're deliberately conflating a civil infraction with a criminal infraction because there's a slipperiness that exists in American history and in American pop culture between these two terms. And I think they're banking on the fact that people don't really know the difference.
That's exactly right. It's a point that we often make in our interaction with journalists or even with well-meaning people asking questions about our work. People will often start with, but surely you agree that anybody who commits a crime should be deported. The problem with that framing is that the definition of the word crime is very elastic, and it can all of a sudden encompass all types of behaviors that many people think, how could someone be banished forever for doing this? Famously, jumping the turnstile is a crime that can result in deportation, that lawyers on our staff, for instance, have had to defend people from deportation for having jumped the turnstile. Yeah. And there's another issue of if the government has the power to do this to him, what makes you think it's not going to do this to you? And so you mentioned the men who were sent to an El Salvador mega prison called Secot. RFK Human Rights actually has ongoing litigation in both with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and in the federal courts in the United States, challenging the legality of that entire episode of American history. And it's well known by now that when people asked President Trump, what about citizens? Could they be sent here? He said, I don't know. Perhaps we'll have to look into that. So it's a slippery slope. What can happen to one can happen to many. And that's part of why we do the work that we're doing here. I can't believe it, but we're almost at the end of our time, Jonathan, and there's so much more for us to discuss together. So I'm hopeful that in the future, maybe you and I can continue this discussion offline. But I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
have one question from one of our viewers today, which I thought we could maybe end with. And it was, if you had to highlight one event, feeling, or experience that you encountered during the process of making the book, which one? What would it be? What would you say really stands out to you as encapsulating this book for you?
Wow. Wow. Um, okay, I'm gonna, in classic maximalist fashion, I'm gonna give you three. Uh, uh, the first is, you know, Juan Ramagosa, who's at the center of this book, uh, is the kind of person who, like, as a journalist, to say nothing of just a human being, but like as a journalist, you're lucky if you get to be close to someone like Juan, once in your career. Certainly, that's how I see it. He is someone who is a kind of living embodiment of not only this broader history, but of a kind of moral calling that pierces all of the politics and all of the kind of low points of American foreign policy and American immigration policy and so on. And he's someone who, at a certain point, he'd been brutally, brutally tortured in El Salvador in 1980. He came to the United States after first, while recovering from some of the wounds that were inflicted on him in torture during these torture sessions in San Salvador in 1980, had actually been helping ferry Guatemalan refugees through Mexico to the United States so they could get linked up with the U.S. sanctuary movement. Eventually ends up becoming the medical director of a kind of legendary medical clinic primarily for Central American, immigrants living in the DC area called La Clínica del Pueblo. And eventually, Juan becomes the named plaintiff. And this is how I first hear about Juan in the early 2000s. He becomes the named plaintiff in a major human rights case in which two Salvadoran generals who had been kind of quietly resettled in the United States with the help of the US State Department uh, were basically brought before a jury in Florida and forced to answer for their involvement in crimes against humanity. And Juan testified firsthand during that case. And eventually, the material that emerged in that case, I mean, that was a civil case where these guys were basically being tried for damages, which they couldn't pay, and the money was never really the point of the case. The idea was more to try to surface this history. But eventually, because of all the material that arose as a result of the investigation and testimony in that trial, the Department of Homeland Security deported these two generals in 2015, at which point they were in their late 70s. Anyway, Juan was someone who I had known about for years, and I had kind of always kind of flirted with the idea of trying to get in touch with, but I could never quite justify the occasion. This is heavy stuff, and I really, as a journalist, if I can avoid, I always try to avoid re-traumatizing people when they talk about what they've been through, and I also want to be very conscious of people's time and their lives, and it's sort of not fair to, you know, back someone into a conversation if there isn't a kind of clear journalistic goal that you have that you can share with the person in your conversation. And anyway, at the start of the pandemic, he and I first began to speak. I finally felt like I had enough material to, like, actually in good faith go to him. And um, I remember that I was in a bit of a panic because the pandemic had just started. I couldn't travel. I mean, I'd taken a leave from work. My leave from work was supposed to start in March of 2020. I technically go on leave a week later. We're all in lockdown. And I think, like, how on earth am I going to be able to do any of this? Like, I was expecting to spend months on end in El Salvador and in Guatemala. And I ended up having a singular experience of my journalistic life, which was Juan and I just started to talk on the phone. And he and I, he and I, we started just on WhatsApp, and it would just be every day at the same time. And we would just have a conversation. He was stuck at home. I was stuck at home. Neither of us could go out because of the pandemic. Um, and the reason I'm saying all of this is, um, I'm not always convinced that journalistic work um, can advance kind of material outcomes for people. Sometimes it can, and I hope it does. Um, But I think as a kind of ethic, the idea of trying to meet someone in his or on his or her terms, in a way in which you're genuinely open and listening and not talking over them, but letting them just speak to you, let their experiences kind of flow to you, and have the burden be on you to try to sort through them and understand them and ask respectful but probing follow-up questions and so on. I learned a lot from those conversations with him because, he's someone who, interestingly, um, he had been trained as a cardiac surgeon. And while he was in the custody of the National Guard in El Salvador in 1980 and was brutally tortured, his torturers said to him, "We're going to incapacitate you. We're going to prevent you from performing surgeries or practicing medicine ever again." So they cut nerves in his hand. He's never fully regained the use of some of his fingers. And a lesser person would have folded as a result of that. I certainly would have folded. Um, and Juan instead, when he came to the United States, started to see in immigrant communities, primarily in Los Angeles and then in San Francisco, a level of trauma that people hadn't worked through and didn't really speak about because there's a source of upset and shame and confusion. And it started to blur together with the indeterminacy of their lives as undocumented people in America in the early 1980s. And Juan began to have these conversations with people. Many of them were, refugees who were homeless, living in MacArthur Park or Dolores Park in San Francisco. And he actually started to realize that there was a broader public health benefit to having these conversations, to giving people a space in which to talk through their experience. And that completely changed his view of what medicine could do. I mean, this is the early 1980s. He's a Salvadoran doctor. He was not kind of steeped in the tradition of psychology or psychiatric medicine or the kind of impact of trauma. This was someone who was very much a kind of old school by the book surgeon, who kind of had his own experience inform him as to the importance of working through trauma. And he started to recognize that a lot of the symptoms that people started to present with, whether he met them on the West Coast or eventually on the East Coast at La Clínica del Pueblo, were manifestations of some underlying psychological trauma or fear or anxiety or upset. And so the context of the sanctuary movement was a very natural one for him because the idea was to marshal the direct testimony of people who fled Central America, who could speak kind of very plainly about what their experiences were. And Juan did that because he saw a value as an activist, but he also saw a value as a medical professional, and he saw a value as someone who had suffered unspeakable trauma. And all of that stuff came out in our conversations, in a way that isn't just, I'm kind of tying this up so it sort of sounds very sort of tidy and obvious. It wasn't. And I'm not an unintelligent person, but I was like not prepared really for the full force of all of this. And it changed how I see the journalism I do, and what the kind of moral imperative is of this work, of journalistic work. Which again, like I don't mean to seem cynical about the core functions of journalism, to inform the public, to try to, hold power to account. All of those things remain central and true. But I also think that there's a way of honoring people's subjective experience and showing them uh, a kind of respect that governments often fail to because they're operating from such a kind of height of policy and disconnect. And so I think that, for me, that experience with Juan, those ongoing conversations, I mean, I've never had an experience like that where I've spoken to someone, normally for the New Yorker, I'll spend months working on a story. I'll maybe speak to someone multiple times. I'll spend a week or two with them. I'll travel out to them a couple of times. But this was like a daily conversation. And every conversation we would go sometimes back over the same material and he'd tell a story in a slightly different way. And that slight change would suggest just a different door that if you opened it in the right way, you could enter a room that was even bigger than the last room you'd been in with him. And it really, that was the experience. And it was
I think
really
what you're talking
profoundly
about,
humbling.
yeah, I think what you're talking about, Jonathan, is the power of bearing witness and how it can change both the person listened to and the person listening.
Yeah.
And I think all of us are really deeply grateful for the care and that you took in telling Juan's story and in bearing witness to that and ensuring that we would have some of the insights that you gained from what is by all accounts, truly a moving relationship. And unfortunately, there's just not enough time in the day for us to really go as deep as we can and would have liked to. But we are so deeply grateful that you joined us here today, Jonathan, for a deeper conversation about your book. I want to remind our audience that those of you who may have missed the presentation of the RFK Human Rights 2025 Book and Journalism Awards in May, you can find that ceremony on our website and YouTube page. The event highlights outstanding student and professional work across a range of media categories, focusing on issues like human rights, social justice, and the power of individual action. All of those themes, which are Jonathan's books tells with dignity. And we thank you for spending your time with us today and hope you'll join us for our next book club conversation on October 22nd, when we'll be speaking with politician and entrepreneur Stacey Abrams about her latest novel, Coded Justice, which deals with the power of storytelling. Jonathan, thank you again so
No.
much for your time here today. And we look forward to what's coming next from you as well.
Thanks so much. Great to chat with you.
You too. Bye.
All right, bye.